Day 13, and it's the end of the course. And the end of your book, the end of your story. Now, as per usual, if you have any questions on storytelling, character creation, world building, improvisation, dialogue crafting, and writing in general, leave it in the comment section. You may also have questions on editing at this point. You may have questions on how to publish your book, how to publish your story, how to promote your book, your story. You may even have questions on drawing, painting, especially digital drawing and painting or traditional drawing and painting. And leave it in the comment section as well, even if we'll have more dedicated course to all these topics. So for this course, if you have questions on storytelling, world building, character creation, improvisation, dialogue crafting, it's here. It's for this course, so we'll use your input to make this course better and better. But if you also have questions on editing, publishing, promoting, and drawing and painting, leave the questions here too, and we'll make use of this question to create our new course, our new specifics course on these topics. Now for Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is your epilogue. It's the true ending of your story. And so, you'll want to make it shorter. You'll want to make it clearer than any other chapter. Now, it's not an exclusive factor here because you want to make your story as clear as you can, but there it will be much easier and at the same time much more important. You want to reveal the cyclical nature of your story here. You want to display this cycle. Now, we've used the clockwise logic for the whole of the course, but you'll see that here it will be a lot more spherical. And finally, you want to make use of this cyclical nature to display your attachment to your story. And why do you want to display your attachment to your story? Because if you show the public how attached you are to your story, or in another way, if you write this story in order to be extremely attached to it, because you're a human being, and the public are human beings, they are highly likely to become attached to your story. So the more you become attached to your story, in a way that you want to be attached to your story, not because you're forcing yourself, the more likely you're to attract others to this story. Chapter 10 is meant to be shorter. Literally shorter. Now, if chapter 10 is not your last chapter, for example, if you're having 12 chapters, the same logic applies. The last chapter, the epilogue, is meant to be shorter, and you want literally to half the number of pages you've been using till now. So if you have 20 pages chapter, 30 pages chapter, you cut that in half. You cut that in half because it's been too long. You know, you want to halve the duration, you want to halve the focus, the energy used to read your book at this point. Everybody, it's the end of the story. Everybody is exhausted. Now, think about it in terms of the public. Put yourself in the public's position. When you watch a movie, when you read a book, when you play a game, that's something like 20 hours plus, or it's 10 intense hours, you're tired. You know, you won't be able to memorize all the elements in the story, the movie, or the game, except if you've played it multiple times. So it's exhausting. It's always an energy-consuming activity. Reading, watching, playing. So you're at the peak of the exhaustion now. You're at the peak, and you know, that's just a follow-up for what we were saying in the final crisis. You're tired. Everyone's tired. It's the end. Everyone wants a conclusion. Everyone wants the story to end. You know, maybe you want the story to end because you want to write another story. That's a possibility. Or maybe you want the story to end because you want to publish your book right now. You know, maybe you're extremely enthusiastic, you're extremely satisfied by what you've done, and you want well, to publish it on your website, for example, or to publish pages in a specific sharing group you're part of, or in any social media, really. The fact is, it's the end. You want to reach that end. There's this definitive character to the conclusion of the story, which is weighted by everyone, because reaching the end, it's a reward in itself, and it's a reward, so people want it. You want to see the end, you want to get the end, to grab the end, you want to experience the end of one of your characters, whatever end it is. So think about it this way: you've written the whole thing, you're tired. The public is reading the whole thing, they're tired. The characters have been through this journey. Your characters are tired. You have to think about them as well. The most tired of everyone here. So they want an ending. They want a conclusion. They won't stretch themselves anymore. So as the author, you may want to write another story. You may want to write maybe a sequel. You may want to write a different story with different characters, different themes, different genre, different environment, even maybe a different frame simply. The same story but with a different frame. You want to rewrite it maybe, to give yourself more room for exploration. So that's it really. It has to be shorter. So chapter 10 has to be shorter. It has to be clearer as well. Now clarity is your goal in any chapter, in any due chapter, in any due scene. And that's why in most cases you want to summarize all of your story into one sentence. And we've got a video for that, and we'll put it in the link in the description. You want to be able to summarize your whole story in one sentence. You want to be able to summarize each chapter in one sentence, and you want to be able to summarize each scene in one sentence. Again, link in the description for knowing how to do that. You're at the end. You've taken the risk to read the whole book. You, the author, have taken the risk to write the whole book. You, the character, have taken the risk to go through this whole journey, and now you'll want a reward. And your reward is the ending, whichever ending it is. So you need to have a great sense of clarity in the transition between risk and reward. So, as the reader, risk to reward. You've read the whole thing, now you want an ending. As the writer, risk to reward. You've written the whole thing, now you want an ending. As a character, risk to reward. You've gone through the whole thing, now you want a reward. And that's why, in most cases, I think good ending, happy ending works well. Because at the end of the story, you want a reward. The very fact of watching, playing, reading is exhausting, so you want a reward for that. And that's why in most cases really happy ending works better. But that's not necessarily what you want to do. So do what you want to do, because you want to develop your attachment to this story. Now, clarity in the stakes. Clarity in the stakes for the protagonist first and foremost. The ending of the protagonist is the only one that should be clear. All the other characters, not a problem if it's not clear. Not a problem at all. Or if it's your genre, it's your story, if it's your frame, if it's your context, giving more inadequately clear, I'll say, something that's, because we don't want to use the word vague here. We don't want a vague conclusion. That's not satisfying. It's never satisfying, something vague. But maybe something a little more tenuous, maybe something a little labor intensive for the mind, something that's more difficult to understand. It may be what you need. For example, if your frame is a mystery, clearly you'll want to have an end that's for a mystery. So for example, your main character may die, but really, did they die? If your a reader of mystery novels, you may have caught some element through the story that tell you that the character didn't die after all. That's an example. That's a mise en abîme here for this kind of story, for this kind of frame. But the same thing for a horror. If you're writing horror, really, does your character need to have a clear ending? Does your character need to have a definitive ending? I mean, your character needs to have a clear ending, but is this ending so obvious? You don't want to make the ending too obvious or too predictable sometimes, especially when it comes to horror. So the clear conclusion for the protagonist first and foremost. And your character can succeed and your character can fail. These are the two antipodes, and you have a large scale of option between them. Now, clarity in the progression. You've just ended chapter 9 and now you're rating chapter 10. So you want to have a clarity in the progression. In chapter 3, you should have seen all the quirks of all the main characters. In chapter 6, you should have a good grasp on what's the behavior of each character, thanks to the climax. In chapter 9, you should be able to tell if your characters have fulfilled their goal or not. Because chapter 10 is just a validation of what chapter 9 has established in terms of goal, and only in terms of goal. Now, when it comes to the clarity of your ending, you want it to be plausible. This will be one of the most difficult questions to answer, and we may make a video especially on that, on what makes an ending satisfying. What makes an ending satisfying enough, let's say, because it's still a little bit subjective. We want to find a way to objectify satisfaction here as much as possible. So, is it because the stakes are clear? Is it because the conclusion is clear? Or is it because the end is plausible just? During your story, because your goal is to create attachment between your character, the public, and yourself. You may have built a lot of goodwill in the public, because you may have created highly likable, highly relatable, or a combination of both in terms of character. So you have relatable characters, you have likable characters, and the public highly likely doesn't want them to suffer. And because they don't want them to suffer, the public is willing to accept some degree of flex. It's highly plausible that the public is willing to accept that you do something that's unexpected in the end of your story. Not something stupid, but something that's really surprising. Really surprising because it helps you to save the character. So, because if your character has suffered a lot through your story, the public is willing to accept, to some degree, the fact that your character is saved at the end, for example. The public is, think about foreshadowing it beforehand. You have to show some elements in chapter, for example, chapter 4 of chapter 7. The anchor chapter are made for that. Foreshadow something before the ending every time. You need to have some element. You have to think about your plausible ending as an argumentation here. You want to present some arguments before the end in order to capitalize on the public's goodwill. But really, don't abuse of it, because it only works if your characters are relatable or likable, and only if they're highly relatable and highly likable. So you want, to some extent, to make your ending plausible if it saves the character. But never forget about the cohesion of your story in general. So that's it about the clarity. We're reaching the end, and we want to reaffirm the cyclical nature of our story. Now, we've thought in terms of cycle through the whole of this course. And we've thought in terms of cycle in order to preserve the soul of the story. It was our main objective, because preserving the soul of a story allows us to generate attachment. No, they are the mirror of one another. Now let's try something different. Let's imagine that the four notions presented here, soul, daily life and the mundane, encounters and relationship, and attachment and belonging, are not on a flat plane, on a plane, but that this plane can be retracted on itself in order to form a sphere. These four notions will be directly linked to one another, because they're now all touching each other. So attachment in daily life, soul and encounters. But what else is there here? When we pass from a cycle to a sphere. Well, let's try to articulate opposite notion in order to exemplify that. Soul and encounters. Well, let's try to say it directly in form of a sentence. The relationships are formed by encounters, and the relationships are the soul, are the core, are the crux of your story. The relationships will define if your story, the relationship between your characters, define if your story will be successful or not, will be satisfying or not. Now, this statement, is it accurate for you? Is it accurate enough? Does character to character relationship and character to environment relationship define your story? We've managed to fact check that, in most of our chapters, because in our crisis, for example, it's the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist, and then after the protagonist and the menace, which put into perspective the story, really. That's what adds depth to the story. In our anchor chapter and in our gathering chapter, it's the relationship between the protagonist and her supporter, or the relationship between the antagonist and her supporter, which add depth to the story. So we can consider that character relationship are what are rhythm the story. The characters' relationship rhythm the story. They really are the crux of the story, because the characters are the crux of the story, and characters don't exist if they don't have relationships. So now let's articulate our two other notions. How does daily life contribute to attachment? Well, as said earlier in the last crisis chapter, daily life is the representation of the mundane, and establishing the mundane, establishing the familiar, will allow you to establish the degree of attachment, because attachment, emotional attachment, is the result of a balance between familiar and surprising. Now, the surprising factor here is linked between the brutal dimension of daily life and the reaction dimension of attachment. The very fact that you can react to something means that it's not something that should be here. It's the pathological state, if you want to oppose it to the ordinary, if you want to oppose it to the normal, if you want to oppose it to the mundane. Now, about the fear and pain dimension. Fear and pain are not only a thing of the surprise. Not only surprise generate fear and pain. The mundane can generate fear and pain as well. The familiar can generate pain. For example, a situation may be painful because it became too familiar, it became overknown, it became excessively mundane, or you may say boring in another way. Now, all this notion, especially the link between the opposite notion, shows us that the regular progression we're using now, the cyclical progression we're using now, is useful when it comes to developing a standard chapter. It's extremely useful because we can go faster. So if we pass from the first notion in red to the second notion in green to the third notion in blue to the last notion in purple, it's easier for us to generate chapters, scenes, and stories faster. But now we're at the end of the story. We want to consider a synthesis of all we've done. We want to consider this synthesis because in order to preserve the soul of our story, or no, saying in a different way, preserving the soul of our story is what will create attachment for our story. So considering a spherical nature to our story, so represent your story in the form of a sphere with all your chapter as smaller sphere on the surface of the sphere, and now all your chapters can interact with each other. You know, it's not a cycle anymore. It's a geometrical construction where all your chapters can interact because they can pass from the surface of the sphere to the center of the sphere to the other side. And you have the ability now, because you've ended your story, because you're at the end of your story, you have the ability to link all your chapters together as you want in order to create the story you want. And that brings you a lot of versatility, because if you can link any chapter to any other chapter, you have multiple combinations of ending. You have multiple possibilities for writing your ending and multiple possibilities to create attachment. And you may want to use many of them. The end of your story allows you to change your representation factor. You've now passed from a cycle to a sphere. And linking all your chapter in this new pattern, in this spherical pattern, allows you to find multiple kind of endings, or saying in another way, multiple kind of attachment factor. And you want to use many of them. You want to use as many of them as you can in order to solidify this attachment. Now, attachment is a fact of three actors. It's an item, it's an object that's thrown from one actor to the next. Now, the three actors are the characters, the public, and you, the author. Stories are inherently interactive, but this interactivity factor isn't tapped enough into, and you may want to reignite it. Your stories may become more interactive if you want to. And generating interactivity, it's quite easy. You just have to reinforce the relationships between the characters, the public, and yourself. And that's attachment, really. Forming a relationship between the characters, the public, and then you. Now, you want to focus first and foremost on the relationship between the characters and the public. But now, how you do it? Well, what are we all doing? The characters are living in your world. The public is reading your world. And you are writing your world. So each of you has a different mission. Your characters are meant to live a believable life in your world. Your public is meant to believe this life to some extent, but they're meant also to question this life because they don't want to believe something that's not believable. And you are meant to write a believable world. So you're focused on the world, the characters are focused on living, and the public is focused on both helping you and challenging you. Now, how does that articulate with the notion of attachment? Well, attachment is all about relationships. Attachment is all about the relationship between characters, and here, the characters are characters, the public are characters, and you're a character. But attachment is also a relationship between the characters, so all the three of us, and the world. Now, how should the world be in order for you, for the characters, and for the public to create an attachment with it? same factor, as usual, same balance. The world is meant to be created to display a balance between familiar and surprising. Every time you're writing a new story, you're proposing new ideas to your characters and to the public. Now, do they know you? Maybe not in the beginning. To some extent, they know you because they're familiar with story structure and their written story. And if you're using elements that are present in older stories, in other games, in movies, you're already giving them a familiar dimension because you're using, for example, a genre, you're using a frame, so you've created a context. So to some extent, they're familiar with your story already because they know this context. Maybe you're writing, for example, an action-adventure type of story, and the frame is mystery. So now, action-adventure, you may think, well, if I want to make it more familiar, I would have used the science fiction frame or the high fantasy frame. Well, you chose mystery. Is that impossible to do? No. It's just a little bit more surprising. Because is a mystery an action-adventure in itself? Not really. Most mysteries are action, most mysteries are drama, some mysteries are horror, but is there really an adventure dimension in mystery? You may consider that. But now we're not talking about pure adventure plus mystery, we're talking about action plus adventure, so that's two genres, plus the frame around it, which is mystery. And you can add even more element to create a more complex content. But let's figure out with that. Familiarity means two things. A familiar context is predictable. A familiar context is known. Now, a familiar context, if it's too familiar for too long and too intensely, can become mundane, can become normal, ordinary. Maybe not as interesting as you wanted it to. What's surprising mean? Surprising means brutal. It means unusual. Now again, brutal does not mean violent. Brutal mostly mean, well, the word that's just under, which is surprising. A new idea, an unusual idea may come to you as brutal. Now, if you have a certain view on an important topic, for example, for living beings, for animals, and for living creatures in general, food, sex, and sleep are three core topics because we're all living beings. So we all eat, need to reproduce, and need to sleep. So any unusual idea which touches one of these topics, one of these themes, one of these centers of interest, may generate a lot of discomfort, a lot of pain in you, because you've not developed the habit of this new idea yet. So it may be painful, or you may not want to develop an habit to this new idea. So it may be painful. So to get back to the feedback episode, you want to be sure to question the perspective of the person giving you this new idea. Because for this person, it's not a brutal idea, it's not a new idea, it's not an unusual idea. But for you it is. And that's why for you, in your perspective, in your state of mind, in fact, it's difficult to accept. So now, about the balance between the two. You want to balance familiar and surprising in relationships. You want to balance familiar and surprising in interactions. So, for example, it's quite unusual for an author to ask directly to the reader to do something. You know, it's unusual. Let's suppose I'm writing a book and you're reading it. I ask you directly in the book, not as the narrator, but as the author, to go to a certain page. You know, for example, you're at the end of chapter 3, and I'll tell you, okay, now you have a choice to make. And I want you to choose. In this book, I've written 2 versions of chapter 4. I want you to choose the version which suits you the most. You may want to read the first version of chapter 4. If so, just turn one page because it's the next chapter. But if you want to read the second version of chapter 4, go to page 100. And it doesn't have to be as literal as that, you know. It can be, if you're chosen that your character succeeds, go to page 80. Or if you've decided that your character fails, go to page 100. And again, maybe that's a little bit too direct for you. You may try, if you've decided that your character crossed the bridge, go to page 80. Or if you've decided that your character returns to the village, go to page 100. You know, and you get back to this familiar structure because you may be familiar to some extent to this kind of books. But it may look surprising, it may feel surprising because you didn't expect that in this book, because this book is not meant to be a play book. But now you come to one realization. You're playing in every story. Every story is a game. And because every story is a game, you have now an incredible tool, the most important tool in terms of creating attachment. Interactivity. Interactivity is the tool to create attachment. And that's how you want to finish your story. So that's a very different insight on what you may expect on an episode, on a course on how to write your ending. Because now what I'm telling you is, if you want to write a satisfying ending, and again, just as said before, leave us the question in comment section when it comes to how to write a satisfying ending, because we'll have more insight, more details on that, and give us your feedback on this way to ending the course, because we're interested in hearing from you, because it may not be so obvious the relationship between interaction and attachment. But that's why we're telling you right now. If you want to create more attachment, you want to create more interactivity. So that's what we have here. That's how we create attachment. A balance between familiar and surprising, just as it was developed through the whole course. But now the turning point is, you have a third dimension, interaction.